Trade reports are escalating as Elliot Friedman and multiple other insiders have reported that one of the best players in the league could be on the move again, and the Toronto Maple Leafs are reported to have interest, and this could change the entire direction of the franchise. We're going to break it all down in this episode of Hat-Trick HQ, but before we do that, a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button. About 72% of you who watch these videos are not subscribed to the channel, so if you want to stay up to date with everything that's going on in the NHL, the trade deadline is just 2 weeks away. It's going to get crazy. It's free. Be sure to hit that subscribe button. But Casey, we got some crazy news this weekend that Mikko Rantanen could be on the move again from the Carolina Hurricanes to another contending team, in a very interesting report from not only the fourth period and David Pagnotta, but Elliot Friedman as well. But Pagnotta said this morning that Mikko Rantanen is now the #1 target in the league at this year's trade deadline, and the teams interested include Dallas, Vegas, Florida, Winnipeg, Tampa Bay, and Toronto. Some interesting other targets on that list for sure, but Toronto is definitely gaining the most traction and interest. Right now, Rantanen makes $4.6 million against the cap, and if they were to retain some more salary, we'll get to this later in the video, it could get very interesting. But before I throw it over to you, Casey, it was reported this weekend from Friedman as well, and multiple other Hurricanes insiders and people covering the Hurricanes have reported that the Hurricanes did offer him a 9-figure $100 million contract that he didn't necessarily decline, but he has not accepted either. What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I mean, the reason he got out of Colorado was because they couldn't pay him what he wanted to be paid, and he gets traded to Carolina. Has been in a little bit of a slump, I would say. He hasn't been himself, we'll say that. But he has got some points, he's got some assists, got some goals, and he's a great player. There's no doubt about that, and he definitely deserves the money that he's after. But, you know, he's getting it offered here in Carolina, but hasn't accepted it yet. That's got to be definitely worrisome for Carolina Hurricanes fans, because if you can't re-sign this guy, you just traded him, one of the most shocking trades of the past 10 years that just came out of left field. Nobody's seen it coming, and you're not going to be able to re-sign him. So if you're Carolina right now, you're saying if he's not going to accept this before the March 7th deadline, we got to get rid of him. And there's a lot of teams that we're going to talk about today that are definitely going to be on him. Definitely the most interesting one being the Toronto Maple Leafs.
And listen, Hurricanes fans, if you're watching this, don't hate me, but I don't believe in the Hurricanes either in their direction. I mean, they don't really have a superstar per se, and they've been doing the same thing for the last couple of years. Have they found success? Yes, they're still a very good regular season team, but they haven't been able to break through the wall in the playoffs either, similar to the Toronto Maple Leafs, who we're going to get into in just a little bit too. But it does make sense to me that Mikko Rantanen said, I'm not so sure about this, right? With this club, with this team, I'm not sure about the direction. I know that they're getting younger, and they do still have a bright future, but it doesn't really maybe make sense for him, right? And he didn't accept it right away. This is a large contract. This is the contract that he wanted from the Colorado Avalanche, and he's getting it here with the Carolina Hurricanes, and he said, let me think about it, right? And the deadline's 2 weeks away, so Carolina's got to make something happen. I mean, a lot of teams are looking at this player. If Carolina were to trade him again, which would be insane, by the way, because like you mentioned, one of the biggest trades in the last 10 years, and then they flip him a few weeks later, I mean, that would be insane. But if they were to trade him again and they retained more salary, because Chicago, if everyone remembers, is retaining 50% of his contract already, teams could get him at this year's trade deadline for $2.3 million, which is insane for one of the best players in the league. Yes, he hasn't figured it out yet in Carolina. He's barely played with the Hurricanes. He got traded there, and then obviously the Four Nations face-off, and he's barely been in Carolina to even see how he likes it. I should also mention that. But $2.3 million is insane. Almost any team can take that on at this point. Any contending team that's right up against the cap can take that on. And if you really get into it, there's going to be a bidding war, I think, for this player in terms of the return, not necessarily the contract, but I'm sure there's going to be talks of a contract, maybe a sign and trade, something like that, or maybe, a handshake agreement, a gentleman's agreement where you're like, hey, you will re-sign with us if we trade for you. But there might be a bidding war. What are your thoughts on that, Casey? Do you think there's going to be a bidding war? Because I feel like they could get a king's ransom for this guy at this year's trade deadline because of how much he would make at $2.3 million.
Yeah, what you're alluded to, like the Carolina Hurricanes are getting younger, and if they kind of want to shift into that direction, they can't sign Rantanen, and they need a trade to happen. There are a lot of teams that are going to be willing to give up a lot of these high-end prospects for Rantanen at $2.3 million. We're talking about a top NHL player coming in for the rest of the year at a Bobby McMann, Nico Sturm contracted. That is crazy. I can't believe that we're sitting here 2 weeks before the deadline talking about Rantanen moving again. It's crazy. But if you're any of these teams and you hear from Carolina that he is available, you got to do anything to get this guy. You got to throw the kitchen sink at him because this guy is an X factor heading into the playoffs for any team. And whatever team gets this guy at the deadline, they're immediately the favorite to win the Stanley Cup.
Yeah, absolutely would be, especially if it's a contender. I don't see any other teams, like I don't see a fringe team being able to make this trade. It just wouldn't make sense. It's got to be a contender, and it's got to be a team that I think that they can re-sign him. And there's only two teams in the entire league right now that I think that he would actually sign with, because we know he's not going to go back to Colorado. And those two teams, and we were going to get into one now, we're going to get into them, is the New York Rangers. And I don't think that they would trade for him, but I do think that he could sign there this offseason, because I do think Chris Drury is going to back up the Brinks truck for him if that's a real possibility. But it's the Toronto Maple Leafs as well. I do believe that he would look at the team and be like, I believe in what you're doing here. You know, I can see a future here for the next 5 years where we could win a Stanley Cup. I'm not sure if that's the same thing being said for the Carolina Hurricanes, as good as they've been, again. Now, when you look at the contract, if you're the Toronto Maple Leafs taking it on, right, you're getting a guy who's only 28, right? So if you do re-sign him, this makes perfect sense. And I know a lot of people in the back of their heads right now are going, what's going to happen with Mitch Marner? We will get to that. But, you know, he's 6'4", he's 220 pounds. We know what he can do. He's won a Stanley Cup. You're getting a $9 million player for 2.3. I say $9 million. That's his current contract. He's going to be a $14 million player with the contract, or the cap going up, right? So when you look at the Toronto Maple Leafs, at this point in time, they really only have to make a couple $100,000 available to acquire this player at this year's trade deadline. And I mean, they're a pretty good team. If you acquire a player like this, you really lengthen the rest of your lineup. If you want to make more cap space, you can trade a Nick Robertson to free up some more. Yes, you're not freeing up a lot, but you free up some more. And that's a guy that I don't necessarily see a future with on this team. You could trade Max Domi if you really want to open up some more cap space. David Kampf, he's been a great player for this team, but he makes 2.4. It's too much for what he brings to the table. So you can definitely still, you know, make a lot of cap room for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Brad Living can, if he wants to get creative, to acquire this player. And again, like I said, you know, they can resign him. I do see them as a team that could resign Rantanen. Casey, I don't know how you feel about that and opening up some cap space, but this has serious implications moving forward on Mitch Marner's future with the team as well.
Yeah, it might be. He's a Brad Schliven guy. He's Brad's guy on paper. He's a big guy who can get it done. He's not just a big power forward type of guy, but he's a guy who can go out there and get you 100 points in a season. I think, in my eyes, he is the perfect replacement for Mitch Marner. I think you have to do anything that you can to get this guy. Whether it's trading Mitch Marner back in the other direction, you don't need to do that, in my opinion, if you're Toronto, because they have some prospects there like Nick Robertson. They have some picks available as well to get this guy in and kind of go all in and keep Marner, keep Rantanen, and then at the end of the season, you got to make a big decision on who are you going to keep, because you can't keep both these guys at $11-14 million contracts, because that would not make sense. But I think if you're Rantanen and he gets traded to Toronto, you see him there more than you see him in Carolina, because no disrespect to Carolina, but Aho and Svechnikov aren't Matthews and Nylander. Because so he's used to playing with stars. He's used to playing with McKinnon. He's used to playing with all these stars in Colorado. And since he's gone to Carolina, we've seen him slip off because he hasn't been playing with top guys. He's not used to being the top guy on a team. So you bring him into Toronto here, I think we see him get right back on track. And I think this could be the guy who puts the Leafs over the edge in regards of getting into the Eastern Conference final, at least, potentially to a Stanley Cup final. I don't know how you feel about it, Darius, but if I'm the Leafs, I think I got to do everything in my power if I'm Brad Schlimming to get this guy into Toronto at the deadline.
Absolutely. This is a guy who would get you over the hump, right? He would, I think. And it's still definitely possible that they don't get there for sure with him. But I mean, he's definitely a guy that I think would help and would make a difference. And the way I see it right now, for $2.3 million, you should go out and get him anyway. Even if it's going to cost you Fraser Minten, Easton Cowan, and a first round pick, I would still make that trade because, if you can re-sign him, if you do have a conversation with his agent, it's like we're open to re-signing here for sure. It's almost an insurance policy for me, a backup plan for Mitch Marner. Because if you go into this year's playoffs, Rantanen has a great playoffs, let's say, and Mitch Marner does the same thing that we've always seen, you can make a decision there and say, we have Rantanen now. We can give him this money. We don't have to re-sign Mitch Marner. Rantanen does everything that Marner does, but on a higher level, and he plays in all situations as well. So it almost, to me, is like an insurance policy where if Mitch Marner doesn't perform in this year's playoffs, which is why they haven't signed him yet. They want to see what happens in this year's playoffs. You can then go, we're going to allot all this money to Rantanen. Mitch Marner will leave, and then we'll rebuild the team a little bit. You wouldn't even have to rebuild the team. You would just take his spot. But for this year's playoffs, I think you still make the trade, even if it is a rental. And I know a lot of Leaf fans might look at that and be like, well, that's a bit crazy. But I think he's a guy that this is an all-in year for the Leafs, right? Everyone is still relatively young. If you look 3 years down the line, we don't know what's going to happen to Chris Tanev and some of the other defensemen on the team. So this year and next year are all in years. And just the way they've been playing, I feel like you have to make a crazy move like this to get them over the hump.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I think Toronto needs to win a Stanley Cup. I mean, if they don't, the fans are going to riot. They cannot take another rebuild. So you got to look at this and say, this place hasn't seen a cup since '67. The fans are fired up. They want something to happen every year in the playoffs. When they get put out, they get their hopes high up. This is the year. This is the year, and it never happens. And Leafs fans right now are so deflated. They need something to pump them up, and Mikko Rantanen is that guy.
Yeah, there's been too much of the same. It's hard to go into the playoffs and cheer for these guys at times because you know exactly what they've done in the past and they don't really show you anything different, right? And I mean, this year the Four Nations did show us something a little bit different. Matthews and Marner playing really well in a deciding game, but it's a little bit hard. So if you give them something to believe in, like trading for Rantanen, where you're like, we are all in, I feel like Leaf fans would be that much more pumped. But it's going to be a very interesting trade deadline this year, KC, and I think all NHL fans are pumped for it because a lot of players are going to be moved. If Rantanen is moved again, I mean, that's going to be just absolutely insane based on what we saw just a month ago. But we want to hear what you have to say in the comments about Mikko Rantanen potentially getting traded again, possibly to the Toronto Maple Leafs. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with everything going on in the NHL.